Hello everyone, we're here at Valente Brothers headquarters from our main mat, tatami, and we would like to take this opportunity to answer a very common question, very frequent question in the last months in relation to our style, in relation to our striking techniques. How come we teach so many striking techniques? Considering that today Jiu-Jitsu, BJJ, is viewed primarily as a ground grappling competition sport. And how come we teach so many of these stand-up scenarios, stand-up techniques, striking techniques? So I think it would be a good idea to try to understand how come striking virtually disappeared from the curriculums of BJJ.
So when Jiu-Jitsu arrived in Brazil, and especially if you look at what was happening in the 30s, Jiu-Jitsu was primarily a challenge match system. The Japanese were already doing that, and the Gracie brothers started to fight primarily against boxers, capoeira representatives, and luta livre, wrestling, catch wrestling fighters. So grapplers and strikers. And there was no way for them to be successful if their system was not complete. So they were able to strike, they were able to grapple, and they were able to take down. That was part of Jiu-Jitsu. Helio Gracie, in many of his fights, his strategy was not to go to the ground against grapplers, against heavyweight wrestlers. His strategy was to use elbows, punches, slaps, kicks to be able to stay away, to use distance to be able to defeat his opponents.
In the 1930s, he fought Dudu, a very top fighter at the time. Oftentimes, we hear that Helio Gracie only fought individuals that did not know really professional fighting, were laymen. This is quite far from reality.
Dudu was like an MMA fighter. He knew grappling, he knew striking, he was a complete fighter and outweighed Helio Gracie significantly. And Helio Gracie was able to win with a kick, actually a combination of kicks. First he threw a high kick to the face, and then he won with a kick to the midsection.
1940s.
1940s, Grandmaster Carlos moved to the Northeast, and most importantly, the fight scene in Brazil changed. Mostly the fights were fake, entertainment rather than reality, and Helio Gracie rejected that completely. The Gracie brothers rejected that completely.
So his brother moved away?
And he started teaching private lessons, focusing more on the development of the self-defense system. Still a complete fighting system that contains striking, grappling, takedowns, and defending against the most common street attacks.
1950s.
1950s, Grandmaster Carlos was the natural fight promoter, moves back to Rio, and they open a school in 1952. And the same thing that was happening in the 30s starts happening again. You have strikers helping them teach their main students in the school. They're preparing for challenge matches, and Carson Gracie, João Alberto Barreto, Hélio Vigio, the main fighter, Robson Gracie, they developed striking skills in order to face those challenge matches, and striking was viewed as an integral part of Jiu-Jitsu.
So similar to what happened in the 30s, in the 50s again. Correct. And I think it's worth mentioning that there were capoeira experts, boxing experts, judo experts,
yes,
wrestling experts,
correct,
all participating in this process.
Yeah, especially in the 30s. In the 30s, the school was a melting pot for fighters from around Rio with different expertises, and they were all exchanging information. They were all training together. And in the 50s, it was no different. They had specialists coming in and helping train the fighters for challenge matches.
1960s.
1960s, you have the boom, the explosion of karate movies, of kung fu movies. And then the perception about fighting changes drastically. People start watching those movies and believing that strikes by themselves are the best way to defend, and that a striker can defeat multiple opponents easily with kicks and punches. And that made the Gracies very upset, because they knew it wasn't true, and they felt that in order for you to be effective in fighting, you had to be complete and not only use striking techniques.
So then maybe that created a process to undermine the importance of striking?
Initially, the Gracie brothers in all their interviews in the 60s would say that striking was a part of their jiu-jitsu, that they were experts in striking, and they had been doing that since the 30s. But eventually, they realized that to beat the strikers, because that became their antagonists, And to defeat the strikers, the best strategy was not to use their striking, but to take the fight to the ground and choke them. And so they became so focused in that to undermine the claims that the karate experts were making, they started saying, maybe undermining striking and saying the striking was not that important.
And it wasn't really the idea. Maybe it was a misinterpretation of the message, and
Correct.
Eventually
it became all about grappling versus striking, and the grapplers were
two
bad-mouthed.
extremes. Two extremes, always dangerous.
Yes.
And they actually
Polarization.
and they actually hurt each other.
Correct, because it became all about the strikers would say, I would never let anybody take me to the ground. Grappling is no good. And the grapplers would say, striking doesn't work. And so
eventually grappling took over, at least in the challenge match scenario, because the grapplers
would win. But still, because you didn't have any high-profile fights in Brazil, the debate continued until 1993.
And the average person still believed more in what they saw in the movies
Correct.
than in these small-time events that maybe occurred.
And then in 1993, with the explosion...
Hold on.
Sorry, go ahead.
1960.
Yes.
1970s.
That continued. The same as in the 60s, the growth of
but I think that we're forgetting to mention, Pedro,
Mm-hmm.
both in the 60s and then in the 70s. In the 60s, the striking, but also the explosion of sport, judo and sport jiu-jitsu eventually, at least the beginning of it.
Correct. And that's, I think, very important, because as the sport of jiu-jitsu grows, the rules did not allow for any striking. And so one more reason for them to start ignoring in large part the striking techniques.
And in the 70s, the same happened.
Same thing happened.
Okay, so, but how come we teach striking?
Because our father is a product of the 50s. And our father was training jiu-jitsu in the 50s. And he wanted us to learn what he learned. And so he would always have great conversations with his teacher, Grandmaster Hélio, and he would tell his teacher that he wanted us to learn what he learned from Grandmaster Hélio. And that was Grandmaster Hélio's essence, even though he was a part of the BJJ movement, he was the president of the federation, but his essence is what he practiced
Exactly.
in the 30s, in the 40s,
Grandmaster
in the 50s.
Hélio loved kicks.
Correct.
Grandmaster Hélio loved throws, takedowns.
Yes.
Grandmaster Hélio really talked about his skills when it came to punching and striking.
Yes.
And of course, he also understood the necessity, and that's the great thing about jiu-jitsu. You use the weapons according to the necessity of that specific battle.
He was able to adapt to the different circumstances. And I think the adaptation to the 60s and the 70s, where you had the explosion of karate, caused this polarization between grappling and striking, which in many ways...
And we see the effects of it
Yes.
until today.
Correct.
Jiu-jitsu black belts, competitors, great ground competitors in sport jiu-jitsu who receive a black belt without one class in how to throw a punch and how to defend a strike and how to throw a kick. Even in throwing techniques, very limited.
Correct.
And the result of this very interesting timeline throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s.
But eventually, because of MMA, it's true that in the beginning, because
it was kind of what happened in the 60s.
Everybody was pure.
Grapplers and strikers.
You know, there was an idea that grappling was superior to striking, and people only wanted to learn grappling. But eventually, once the strikers learned the grappling, it was shown that the original jiu-jitsu message, what was being said in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s by the Gracie brothers, which is that it's not about learning only grappling, only striking, it's about being well-rounded.
Yeah, and even this was lost within the lineage of jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Gracie jiu-jitsu, right? Quite different than what was seen in the 1930s, 1950s. Yes. It's also important mentioning that the benefit of having this integrated system, right, that we learned, is that you have a message. It's like having a football team with a head coach, an offensive coordinator, a defensive coordinator, a special teams coordinator, instead of having a football coach, a rugby coach, a soccer coach, similar sports, but quite different. That would not work. And that's why we believe that you should have a centralized system. And that's what is happening now in MMA, even though what we do is not MMA. Our objective is self-defense, is survival, is street. But of course, with the specialization of MMA, we see how it's important to have an integrated system so that you're not also having confusing messages.
Integration is better than mixing.
Yes. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to subscribe, like our video, and leave your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you.